Okay, so welcome Manjeet and Simon. Thank you very much for coming along and giving this webinar presentation today, looking at decolonising political theory. Thanks ever so much. I'll pass over to you to sort of start the presentation, and at the end have a brief Q&A session if that's okay with you. Brilliant. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Adrian. So hopefully you can all see those slides now. So thank you everyone for coming. We're going to be talking about decolonising political theory, drawing on some research that we've done both independently of each other and together, and also drawing on a book that we co-edited and which came out this year, which we'll talk about later. What we'll do today is that we'll start off by looking at the term decolonisation, what it means, and then we'll look at the various normative reasons that have been put forward for decolonising the curriculum. Then we'll focus on our own discipline or sub-discipline of political theory, and I'll look at some empirical research I've done on the extent of decolonising. Then we'll consider some of the changes that we've begun to make, both to our own curricula, but also through this book that we've edited. And we'll finish off by thinking about some of the challenges to decolonisation. I'll talk for about 15 or 20 minutes or so, and then I'll pass over to Manjeet. Okay, so I won't spend too long on this because my hunch is, decolonisation has become a bit of a buzzword. So my sense is that most people will have some idea of what we mean by decolonising the curriculum, but we'll just talk about what we mean by it. I think we trace the current wave of interest in decolonising the curriculum. We trace it back especially to the Rhodes Must Fall protests in South Africa in 2015. Protests which then spread around the world to Oxford and to other places in the UK and other places around the world. It's a campaign which we think was also given impetus by the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020. Campaigns to decolonise the curriculum have often been student-led and a result of student demands, and we would also link it, loosely at least, to the kind of renewal or reactivation of student activism in the UK since about 2010, especially from about 2012 in particular, and around the anti-fees movement in the UK. But calls to decolonise the curriculum, or at least to decolonise forms of knowledge, discourse and culture, are much more long-standing and can be traced back at least to the post-war anti-colonial movements. So, Fanon, for example, argues that the forms of knowledge that hold colonial power structures in place must also be dismantled. So we think decolonising the curriculum is a legitimate and significant enterprise. There's a very widely cited and quite famous and very good article called "Decolonisation is Not a Metaphor" by Tuck and Yang, in which they argue that decolonisation has to mean the repatriation of indigenous land, and that things like decolonising the curriculum risk become ways of relieving white guilt without changing existing distributions of power and land. And while we acknowledge that is a risk, and that, as I said, decolonising can become a bit of a buzzword and can become co-opted by institutions and sort of emptied of any content, we also think it's as I said, legitimate and important to think about how the ways in which we think, write and speak all reflect and potentially perpetuate the legacies of colonialism. So what it means in practice, decolonising the curriculum, well, also, I should say, universities are an important part of this project. for at least three reasons. So historically, universities, especially in the UK, have had deep ties with colonialism. So they've educated rulers and administrators in the colonies. They acted as models for the establishment of universities in the colonies, and many British universities were directly funded via colonial dispossession. Secondly, a central legacy of colonialism today is the continued existence of racial inequalities, and those inequalities are reflected in and reinforced by British universities. For example, in the underrepresentation of BAME staff, especially their underrepresentation at senior levels. And then thirdly, universities are important because they remain a central site for producing and validating knowledge in our societies. And so potentially, at least, that they can play a role in challenging prevailing attitudes towards and about colonialism. So, I mean, decolonizing the university can mean lots of things, including looking at symbolic representation, statues, and so on, staff and student representation, the funding of universities, racial discrimination on campus, etc. What we're going to be focusing on is decolonizing the curriculum, although we don't see it as separate from those other issues. And what this means in practice, decolonizing the curriculum, is obviously a matter of ongoing debate. And that is partly because one thing that decolonization definitely involves is an appreciation that there are a variety of ways of thinking and speaking about social and political phenomena. And therefore, curricula, the content of a curriculum cannot and should not be prescribed in advance. But nonetheless, in practice, we would argue that at a minimum, a decolonized curriculum will be one that does these three things on the top of the slide here. So, firstly, acknowledging and discussing the colonial context within which theories have been developed. Secondly, recognizing that there are alternatives to Eurocentric forms of knowledge, and that those alternatives were often suppressed by colonial domination. And then lastly, including study of and readings by figures and thinkers and authors who are not white and who also are not men, because we also link colonialism and patriarchy, and we see the inclusion of women in the curriculum as equally as important as the inclusion of non-white thinkers. So very broadly speaking, I mean, what we're thinking about here is the politics of knowledge production. So what counts as knowledge and whose knowledge counts? What and who are included or excluded, and why? As for why we should decolonize, I mean, numerous normative arguments have been put forward in favor of decolonizing the curriculum. We've highlighted three at the bottom of the slide here. So firstly, there's a kind of intellectual argument. This is the claim that students won't have a comprehensive or accurate overview of their subject if we exclude discussion of colonialism and race, or if we only teach white male thinkers and authors. And this argument is obviously especially pertinent to politics, because politics is explicitly about the study of power relations. And it's difficult to claim that colonialism, which is arguably the major power relation that structures the world over the past 500 years, it's difficult to argue that that should for some reason be excluded from the study of politics. Secondly, there's a kind of multiculturalist argument, namely that there is a need for curricula to reflect and respect the ethnic diversity of our student body. And this second argument takes a couple of forms. It can take a kind of more pragmatic form, which says that decolonizing might be a way to reduce the ethnicity awarding gap, i.e. the gap between the award of good degrees to white students and to non-white students. Or it can take a stronger, more normative form associated more explicitly with multiculturalist thinkers like Charles Taylor, which is that the claim that if certain cultures are presented as unworthy of study, then students from those cultures are harmed because they're offered a degraded image of themselves. Now, we agree with this argument, and we agree that acknowledging and respecting diversity is an important goal, but on its own, we think it's probably insufficient reason to decolonize, because if your aim is that curricula should reflect the diversity of students, then logically that implies that if you have a very white student body, if you teach at a very white university, you can have a very white curriculum, and that can't be right. So we support this argument, but on its own, we think it's not enough. So lastly, what we think is maybe the strongest argument in favor of decolonizing the curriculum, which is what we're calling a democratic or anti-racist argument, which presents decolonizing the curriculum as a modest but necessary contribution to the continuing effort to free ourselves from colonialism and its legacies, and indeed from the persistence of colonial power relations today. So this third argument proposes that a decolonized curriculum has to be addressed as much to white students as to non-white students, and proposes that there's an urgent need to address white ignorance of colonialism. So they're the sort of normative arguments in favor of decolonizing the curriculum. Now, Manjeet and I are both political theorists, and arguably political theory is the one sub-discipline of politics which is best placed or ripest, shall we say, for decolonization. And that's partly because it's in political theory that we claim to introduce students to the foundational thinkers, theories, and concepts of the study of politics, and even of the social sciences and humanities more generally. So I think political theorists can sometimes feel a bit marginalized within the discipline, but nonetheless, it still does have this foundational place within it. And virtually all students studying for a politics undergraduate degree will study some core or compulsory module on political theory. And sometimes those modules start with Plato and Aristotle and work through there. Sometimes there's a few sort of medieval thinkers. Very often they start with Machiavelli or Hobbes, and they're called something like modern political thought. There's typically a module which will be taken by second-year undergraduates, maybe at first-year level. And political theory as a discipline is dominated by a canon of dead white men, and those compulsory modules in political theory are dominated by, the same canon. So these thinkers on the slide are typically what you might learn in a 12-week module like that. So you'd start with Machiavelli, you do the social contract thinkers, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau. Sometimes there's a kind of token woman in there. In this case, I put Wollstonecraft there. You quite often do Burke as a representative of conservatism. You would contrast Kant and Mill, and you might have Tocqueville there in the middle. You could do more radical thinkers like Marx and Engels, and then it sort of gets brought up to date, so to speak, with Rawls and his critics. So all of these thinkers are white. I mean, this is the sort of module, in fact, this is certainly the sort of module that I studied at undergraduate level. And it's the sort of module that I was teaching up until relatively recently, up until maybe 7 years ago or so. Would mainly be teaching white thinkers. Now, they're not only all white, these thinkers. I mean, many of them are also explicitly racist as well. So I've given a couple of examples on the side of the slide there. I'm neither a Kantian nor a Kant scholar, but it is an undeniable fact that in numerous places in his work, in his published work, Kant makes explicitly and very strongly racist pronouncements. So he believes there's a racial hierarchy and that white people are at the top of it. That second quotation is from Mill. I think it's from On Liberty, in which Mill defends British imperialism with a racist reference to what he calls barbarians. And I mean, all of these thinkers and all modern political thinkers are in some way entwined with colonialism, because colonialism is foundational to the modern world. And so social contract theory, for example, I mean, is rooted in colonialism, and it's not a coincidence that the concept of the state of nature develops at a time of, or simultaneously with, the colonial encounter between Europeans and non-Europeans, the very violent and oppressive encounter, obviously. And this is made explicit in Hobbes and Locke, for example, when they use America as an example of a state of nature, because when Europeans get to the Americas, they don't see people living in European-style societies and with European-style states. So they think of them as these states of nature in which there is no state or formal form of government. Okay, so there is this need, we think, to decolonize the political theory curriculum, but there's also a demand. So I'm just going to share a bit of recent empirical research I've done. So I recently published an article comparing decolonizing economics and politics curricula. I co-authored it, not with Manjeet, with some other people though. And as part of that project, we surveyed the views of politics teaching staff in the UK. The response rate, as you can see, was a bit disappointing. It was under 10%. Nonetheless, the results are still worth examining. So we surveyed politics staff in general and not just political theorists. But as you can see on this slide, most politics staff surveyed knew about decolonizing the curriculum. And they think it's important, but they think not enough has yet been done. And maybe more interesting than these quantitative results are the qualitative results, the comments we got back in the survey. So when we asked respondents to the survey why they thought decolonizing the curriculum was important, their responses, they gave three responses in particular, or their responses could be collected in three different ways, which reflect those three normative arguments that I looked at earlier: the intellectual argument, the multiculturalist argument, and the anti-racist argument. So first of all, this idea that it's necessary for understanding the discipline. This is what I call the intellectual argument. We can't, it's impossible really to teach politics and to understand the political world without thinking about colonialism. Secondly, the idea that it benefits students and it's in the interests of students. So this is something like the multiculturalist argument, that curricula should reflect the diversity of the student body. And then lastly, the idea that decolonizing can help challenge racist hierarchies and inequalities. So this is something like what I termed the democratic anti-racist argument. And this survey was a part of a project, as I said, comparing politics and economics curricula. I won't look at the economics results here, but I'll just note that in the survey, economics staff, the response rate was better, but they were much more hostile and resistant to the decolonizing agenda. So this quotation from an economics staff member at the bottom here, it was relatively typical of the kind of responses that we got from economics staff. So we think people in politics are probably more open to decolonizing, but at the same time, what we found is that decolonizing has not got very far. So also in this article, we undertook an audit of politics courses in the UK. So we looked at every politics degree in the UK, and we looked at the online course descriptors. So the description of the course that you would find on the website for prospective students. And we tried to establish via this how decolonized the courses were, by looking for references to colonialism or imperialism or related themes like slavery, the civil rights movement, racism, etc. And what we found is that almost 90% of them made no reference to colonialism, race, or race-related themes in these online course descriptors. In an earlier article that I did, I also looked more specifically at political theory modules. So what I did is that I found the core political theory module that all students would take from each university offering a politics degree. And I looked at the online module descriptor and at reading lists where they were available. And I tried again to establish how decolonized that module was by looking for references to colonialism and race and so on. And what I found is that students at UK universities who take the key political theory module will more likely than not read only white thinkers and will not be asked to consider the views of those white thinkers concerning race and colonialism. So we think there's a need to decolonize and a demand for it, but despite this, the existing resources have traditionally not been available for decolonizing. So many political theory textbooks only include white thinkers. So maybe the most widely used textbook is this one on the screen here, Political Thinkers. We'll continue to use it again. But it is, as you can see from the contents listed here, it doesn't contain any non-white thinkers. And it contains only 2 women thinkers, Arendt and Wollstonecraft. And that quotation on the other side of the slide there is from another textbook, Reading Political Philosophy. I've just put that there to show when the topic of colonialism is raised, it's often quickly dismissed. So this is a discussion in the chapter on John Stuart Mill, where reference is made to Mill's defense of imperialism, colonialism. But this reference is sort of glossed over or kind of whitewashed, shall we say. So those are what we think are some of the problems of the discipline of political theory. And now Manjeet is going to look at what we propose as some of the solutions, assuming we're not kicked out of this meeting. Manjeet, I'll pass over to you now. Oh, and I'll move the slide on.
Okay, thank you very much, Simon. And sorry, I was just racing to copy down the link because I'm not able to copy it with my computer, so I'm jotting it down by hand. Anyway, I just would like to thank Adrienne, Kathy, and Vicky for inviting us, and the PSA Teaching and Learning Network as well before I start. And also a huge